Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's jump right into a truly fascinating historical puzzle today. Have you ever stopped to wonder how an 11th century medieval social system fundamentally reshaped Western Christianity's entire understanding of salvation? Well, today we are going to unpack the work of Anselm of Canterbury and see exactly how the feudal roots of satisfaction essentially rewired theological history. I mean, think about this for a second. Did a medieval political system rewrite the rules of salvation? It honestly sounds like a historical conspiracy theory, but it's actual historical theology. We're going to explore how the super-rigid, structured feudal world of kings, lords, and vassals might have literally replaced the original, sweeping biblical narrative with a strict medieval legal contract. So here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with the feudal theological shift, look at how sin became the stealing of divine honor, and break down Anselm's famous God-man equation. After that, we'll examine the fallout of choosing a courtroom over a covenant, before finally returning to the original restorative plan. Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the feudal theological shift, moving from healing to the courtroom. To really get this, we need to travel all the way back to the year 1098, where Anselm of Canterbury found himself dealing with a massive intellectual crisis. So, Anselm is exiled in Italy, right? And he's facing some incredibly intense pressure from Islamic and Jewish scholars. They were arguing that the Christian cross was inherently irrational. Like, why would an all-powerful God subject himself to a shameful execution when he could just issue a sovereign decree to forgive people? It's a fair question. To defend the cross, Anselm introduced a pretty radical method, ratio sola, which means by reason alone. Since his critics didn't accept the authority of the New Testament, Anselm decided to just drop the biblical story entirely for his argument. Instead, he relied on pure, independent philosophical deduction to prove that human salvation was only possible through the incarnation and death of a God-man. He basically argued his case as if we knew absolutely nothing about Christ from the scriptures. And this sparked a massive paradigm shift. Think about it. For nearly 1,000 years, the Eastern patristic view treated sin like a disease. Early church fathers like Gregory of Nyssa saw salvation as ontological healing. To them, the church was essentially a hospital for corrupted flesh. But Anselm's new Western view? It entirely swapped out that hospital for a courthouse. He introduced a very strict courtroom mentality where sin is suddenly viewed as the theft of honor and salvation becomes a necessary legal satisfaction. Which brings us to Section 2, stealing infinite divine honor, and what sin looked like in a feudal world. To really grasp Anselm's logic here, we have to look closely at the rigid social rules of his 11th century reality. Anselm argued, quote, "He who fails to give God the honor which is due to him takes from God what belongs to him, and that is what sin is." Now, context is absolutely crucial here. In medieval society, honor wasn't just about having a bruised ego or protecting your personal self-esteem. Honor was an objective, structural social reality. It was literally the glue that kept the entire kingdom from plunging into total chaos. If you stole a king's honor, you disrupted the entire order of the universe. So naturally, offending an infinite God, well, that carries an infinite debt. So this puts God in a real cosmic bind, which Anselm solved with the concept of satisfactio. See, God couldn't just forgive sin with raw mercy, because in a feudal mindset, that would cause injustice and total disorder. But on the flip side, he couldn't just destroy humanity and ruin his own creation. So divine justice demanded satisfactio. In medieval Germanic and Roman law, this meant an offender avoids punishment by returning the stolen property plus paying an extra proportional sum just for the insult caused. God's objective honor absolutely had to be satisfied. It's kind of like having to pay a cosmic, infinite parking ticket just for offending the king of the universe. Let's move to Section 3, the God-man equation, solving the cosmic dilemma. Because fallen humanity was utterly bankrupt at this point and couldn't even pay its daily debts of obedience, Anselm started treating salvation like a strict, unavoidable mathematical equation. Here is how he laid it out in his famous three-step logical deduction from his book Cur Deus Homo, which translates to Why God Became Man. Step 1. Humanity owes an infinite debt because, well, humanity committed the theft. Step 2. Only God can pay an infinite debt because no being is greater than God. Step 3. Therefore, the payer must be a God-man. The payer has to be entirely human to actually owe the debt, but entirely divine to have the infinite capacity to pay it. It's an airtight, perfectly structured piece of logic. But this specific math required yet another big shift. The early church had always believed Christ took on diseased flesh, meaning a mortal nature, so he could heal it from the inside out. Anselm, however, argued Christ needed pristine flesh. Why? Well, if Jesus was naturally mortal, he would owe death just as a basic legal duty. By having pure immortal flesh, his death wasn't a requirement. It became a totally voluntary overpayment. It was a supererogatory act that carried infinite value, entirely covering humanity's massive debt. Now, for Section 4, Courtroom over Covenant. Let's look at the real fallout of this shift. Anselm's logic is tight, sure, but what actually happens when you reduce a beautiful, transformative, healing story down to a strict medieval legal contract? As you might guess, this courtroom model faced immediate and massive critiques. First off, it literally subordinates God's freedom to legal necessity. God becomes trapped by his own legal rules of consistency. He can't just choose to forgive. Second, human transformation becomes entirely passive. We're just the recipients of a heavenly legal pardon with no real interchange required. Third, it completely sidelines the resurrection, reducing it to just a personal reward for Christ, rather than the core mechanism of our salvation. And finally, it sparked intense critiques of divine violence almost right away. Thinkers like Peter Abelard felt this entire framework made God look incredibly cruel. The root of the whole problem really lies in contrasting definitions of justice. Anselm was relying entirely on retributive justice, which is a Roman and feudal concept heavily focused on strict punishment or equivalent payment. But the Hebrew scriptures, they rely on covenantal justice. That's a framework deeply focused on deliverance, on jubilee, and on repairing society. Basically, Anselm was calculating salvation on a Roman ledger, while the Bible operates on a framework of holistic restoration. And that brings us to this absolutely beautiful Hebrew word, mishpat. It translates to biblical restorative justice. It's all about God's active work in setting the oppressed free, restoring outcasts, and repairing broken covenant relationships. Think of the year of Jubilee, where debts are entirely forgiven and slaves are freed. Biblical justice isn't about balancing some cosmic ledger of honor. It's about delivering and restoring a broken world. Which leads us nicely to Section 5, the restorative promise plan. Returning to the narrative, if we finally step out of Anselm's 11th century courtroom, what exactly is the alternative? The source material champions a return to a grand, unified biblical narrative. Theologians like Walter C. Kaiser Jr. call this the promise plan, and it's an amazing arc. It traces all the way back to Genesis 3:15 with the initial promise of the seed. Then it flows steadily right through the Abrahamic covenant, moves to the Sinai priesthood, establishes the Davidic royal line, and goes all the way down to the new covenant prophecies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. This is a dynamic story of a God who binds himself by a promise and remains faithfully committed to it across thousands of years of history. It is definitely not a static, one-time legal equation. Ultimately, scholars like David Brandos and N.T. Wright argue that the cross is simply not a mathematical equation. It's not a payment to an angry ruler. Rather, it is the absolute climax of the Messiah's faithfulness. It's the ultimate manifestation of covenantal love that actually inaugurates the kingdom, uniting Jews and Gentiles while still preserving the enduring calling of ethnic Israel. In this view, the cross and the resurrection work perfectly together to overcome the powers of evil and bring about a completely new creation. So, I want to leave you with this to chew on. Does viewing salvation as a mathematical transaction obscure the beauty of an evolving, restorative narrative? Anselm's feudal logic of satisfaction undeniably shaped Western thought for nearly a millennium, heavily emphasizing the sheer gravity of sin. But think about this. When we trap God's grand restorative story inside an 11th century courtroom, how much of that beautiful transforming narrative do we actually lose? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today, and as always, keep asking great questions.